Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I've had a couple of busy and exciting weeks. Our main adventure was a trip to Boston. David and I drove up with our son Abe, who, after a 1-year leave of absence, is returning to college for his senior year. He's studying both English and theater, and his primary side loves are folk music and sound engineering, etc. Since both theater and music on campus were so severely restricted last year, and for one of the 2 semesters, his grade would not have been allowed to live on campus anyway. All classes for students, even those who were living in the dorms, were online. But this year looks like it will be different. His school has required all students without medical contraindications to be vaccinated. It requires students, even though vaccinated, to wear masks in indoor situations when they aren't with roommates or equivalents, etc. Theater is going to be possible, potentially, but controlled pretty carefully. My son, a Shakespeare nerd, is hoping to direct his very favorite Shakespeare play, The Winter's Tale, possibly outdoors during the fall. I do hope everything will work out on that front, and I hope that David and I will be able to travel north again to see his performance. Abe packed fairly lightly for this year, mostly in case students were forced to move out quickly as they were in March of 2020. His dorm room is a small single, next door to one of his best pals. After he took his books and bedding and instruments up to his room, David helped him drive around the area to pick up a beautiful and free wingback chair that fits in one of the little open spaces in this room, as well as a small rug to go next to his bed in front of his window. It was definitely sad to say goodbye to him at the end of our trip, but honestly, living at home in our small house with not a whole lot of freedom to get out from under us was not the easiest thing for him. From freshman year until spring of his junior year, he'd become more and more independent and mature, and he's definitely ready to live on his own without his parents looking over his shoulder all the time. I can't wait to see what he'll do this year and what will be coming next. While we were in town, we stayed at our friend's house, sadly, while she and her family were away at the beach. They have a beautiful kitchen, and we very much enjoyed cooking our meals there. In a recent tag video, I mentioned how many kitchen gadgets I own, but our friends definitely outdo us. And they have amazing bookshelves, too. I thought about my tagline as I looked at the rows and rows of color-coordinated books. Hello, I'm Hannah, and these are Kelly's books. But Kelly's books were not the only books I saw. In addition to picking up a couple of volumes at a little free library, I had the opportunity to go to the used bookstore that rules them all, the infamous Brattle Bookshop. David and I walked from our temporary apartment to the shop just in time to watch the staff prepare the outdoor sale lot. Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is the Brattle Bookshop. Before the crew had finished bringing out the carts, who should arrive but BookTube's own Steve Donoghue? It was a joy to meet him and to have him introduce us to the Brattle. We spent quite a while browsing the carts and the shelves on the sides, full of books sorted only by their price. Some carts contained books for $5, while others held $3 books or $1 books. Next to complete hardback sets of Henry James were cookbooks and travel memoirs. It was such a delight. And then, when we got hot enough, we went into the air conditioning to visit the shelves indoors. Much more organized and not quite as inexpensive. I spent a lot of my time in the literature section, but there was an enormous history of Boston section downstairs as well. Upstairs was the Shakespeare shelf, and history, and on and on. I've never really made a haul video before, I don't think, but somehow a Brattle haul seems in order, and I'll try to put one together during the coming week. As wonderful as the Brattle is, the real treat of the morning was the opportunity to meet Steve. We had arranged to split our visit, time at the Brattle one day and an evening at Hyde Cottage the next. When I arrived at his house, I barely said hello to Steve, and immediately got to know Frida. I knew she would be adorable, but she's even sweeter and smaller and funnier and bossier in person than she is on screen. The next thing I took in was Steve's stunning collection of amazing history books and books about books and penguins with all the personal trinkets that so many of you have sent him. All I could think was, hello, I'm Hannah, and these are Steve's books. So after meeting Frida and communing with the books, less than I could have if there were no other evening attractions, I chatted with Steve a bit, and we ordered a calzone and other treats from the place next door. If you ever go, I highly recommend the spinach and feta calzone. Before we tucked in, and before we poured the wine, Steve convinced me to film a video with him. As you surely have guessed from this channel, I am fairly shy and reserved. Well, actually, I'm terrified of the camera and have to practice what I'm going to say in advance of filming. Or at least, that's what I thought until the night of wine and calzone. I know many of you have seen it and might say I was still a bit quiet and potentially nervous, but for me, I was amazed. Steve made me feel right at home, and we managed to chat for 90 minutes, split into 2 videos. I will leave a link down in the description box, just in case you haven't seen the discussions yet. Thank you for all your kind comments. It's always funny to see myself on screen, as I did the next morning when Steve posted the videos. Mostly, I was very happily shocked that I really did appear on screen just as comfortable as I felt in person. Of course, I also noticed what doesn't really show as clearly in my usual videos, my asymmetric face. The particular angle of my setup here at home sort of hides the asymmetry, as does the fact that I rarely actually break out laughing on camera by myself. And of course, big grins are when the crookedness shows the most. I cringed when I saw the first second of the video, but very quickly I didn't care at all. I loved seeing that joy of my laughing because it reminded me of how I felt in the moment. But I wanted to say 2 things about it here. The crookedness is a result of surgery I had decades ago, and while I have residual changes from that surgery, everything is totally stable, and it's not a continuing health issue in any way. Second, the side of my face that is less mobile does not show my smiles nearly as much as the other side. I hope when you watch me, you'll know to read my emotions as the smiling side. I've been saying how much I enjoyed the conversation and how pleased I was that I did not faint as soon as Steve turned on the camera, but I realized that no matter how comfortable I was, I still didn't think of answers and responses as quickly as I would like to be able to do. The major case of this is about modern art. After Steve ridiculed Rothko and Calder and their ilk as frauds, referring to their work as the crap at the MoMA, that is the Museum of Modern Art, I said back that I, in fact, really love the crap at the MoMA, but I didn't come up with much more at that moment. Steve was teasing me a bit with his rant, but nevertheless, I think he earned a real response. He made an argument that great art is fundamentally about skill, and he says that the whole point is that you cannot do it yourself. Now that I have some slow, quiet time to think it out, I don't think I agree that art is fundamentally about skill. I think I would prioritize not skill, but vision as in visionary. I want to see art that makes me think, that makes me imagine more, makes me see more than I do, not just paint more or sculpt more, or see it differently from the way I usually see. By definition, that is somewhat harder to do if what an artist values most is precise representation. Yes, I know that artists who are interested in realistic representation are visionary as well as skilled, but the clarity of their visionariness is a bit harder for a person uneducated in art to approach. Steve suggested we needed the brochure in order to tell us what we're looking at when we look at modern art, but I find the opposite to be true in some way. While we know what we're looking at, unless we know quite a bit about art, it can be quite difficult to understand why it is skillful or how it works. What moves me the most in art is not realistic representation. At least in this era, when everyone has a camera in their pocket, exact realism can feel awfully quotidian. Strangely, I think it's fundamental to Steve's definition of art that the object not be the real thing, but just a very careful rendering of it. A real skull on a table, or a real child playing with a pet squirrel, or whatever, is an art. The creation of it from other mediums is. Isn't that Duchamp's point with found art, or, quote, ready-made art, like his urinal or bicycle wheel? Duchamp points out that we define the representation of reality as art, but we don't say that reality itself is art. The representation, rather than the reality, is what is necessary, isn't it? Instead of representation, I'm more interested in interpretation, in imagination. Rather than less accessible, I find these works of interpretation and imagination to be, if anything, more approachable. Steve said that it was about skill, but for me, the reason to love art is not to admire the artist's skill, but to admire the artist's vision. Artists can imagine more, can see more than I do. I fully realize there's plenty of room on all sides to enjoy different kinds of art. I realize that if one is looking for what conventionally would be considered beautiful, a lot of modern art might not cut it. But for a lot of viewers, those of us who might know a lot about art, as well as those of us who just enjoy it without much knowledge at all, various kinds of modern art moves us. Not because of some critic telling us we're stupid if we don't appreciate it. And with that last point, I totally agree. If an art critic or a book critic or any other kind of critic tells you you're stupid if you don't like something, or stupid if you do, they just aren't the critics you should be reading or listening to, much less believing. Well, anyway, it was a fantastic discussion, even if I was a little too slow to give Steve the sparring partner I think he deserves. After dinner and wine and more hours of wonderful bookish and even some deep personal conversation, I said my goodbyes to Steve and got a ride back to our friend's house where my husband was trying to stay awake for my very late return. The next morning, we went for a walk to visit the lovely Boston Public Gardens, with a swan boat just like the one in Robert McCloskey's picture book, Make Way for Ducklings. Someday I'll share a story with you about my father reading that book to me and then to my brother. But for now, I'll just share these adorable pictures of kids enjoying the sculptures of the ducklings. We also walked past another interesting bookstore, this one aimed at young people, with this wonderful placard right outside. The night before we left, we had a special dinner with our son. Our host, the friend on vacation, sent us the recipe for one of her favorite cocktails using ingredients she had on hand, many of which I had never tasted before. The drink is called a Kaiser Blade and has Aperol, Lillet, a touch of ginger liqueur, grapefruit juice, lime juice, and soda water. Delicious. And for after our meal, David made a dark and intense chocolate mousse, which we had with raspberries and champagne. Amazing. On Thursday morning, we packed up all our stuff, including all the books we bought at the Brattle, and loaded the car. As soon as the highway had taken us out of town, we turned on a fascinating audiobook, Clint Smith's How the Word is Spread, a nonfiction book which is part history and historiography, part study of how memory works in communities at large, and part personal memoir. So far, I am loving it, although I think I'll be switching to the text edition to finish the book. When I've completed it, I'll talk more about it on this channel. As the drive continued and we were in need of something a little more peppy and playful to keep us awake as we headed down to our home in the Washington, D.C. area, we turned on music we had loved in the 1980s when we were in high school and college. Some of the music we loved then was old at the time. In the car, we tried our best to sing in harmony with the Indigo Girls. We crooned along with James Taylor, including the song we each responded to for very different reasons, Stories for Another Day, Gone to Carolina, in my mind. And to be honest, I teared up when Cat Stevens' Peace Train came on. It's a song of such hope for the world. The speaker says, or rather sings, that he's on the edge of darkness, as is the world. And now I've been crying lately, thinking about the world as it is. Why must we go on hating? Why can't we live in bliss? But he assures something good has begun, as he says. The peace train is coming, and he believes that he and his generation could create a better world. It's not so far from you, he says, and it's getting nearer. Soon it will all be true. I don't think any of us have that kind of hope for the world anymore, do we? But I guess that is why it's so important to hold on to what we love, whether it's watching our children grow up or reading books or having great conversations with new friends, or at least new real-life friends, looking at great art, no matter how we define it, celebrating with family members and old friends, in person or apart, having adventures, whether they are trips to faraway cities or walks around the neighborhood or singing out of key together. Here's to living in bliss. Thanks for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.